Hello all. So today I'm going to briefly go over chapter 3 in the Writing Philosophy by Lewis Vaughn book that we used at the very beginning of the semester. Um, so this isn't mandatory reading, of course, but it's useful for writing your papers. So it's 10 pages. If you want to go ahead and read it, that's awesome. It'll be helpful. If not, you can just listen to this lecture or do both and you'll be the most well prepared. So I'm just going to talk about the various points and you can follow along, pause the video, jot things down, or if you can just listen and get something out of it that way, that'll work well. But there's a number of points. I guess I have 7 here that I want to emphasize from this chapter. So I'm just going to talk about them in sequence, and some of them will be some things that I've already somewhat mentioned, but I think this is just one more useful resource. We don't get a lot of in-class time to work on these writing skills, so just another way to kind of emphasize this similar material. So I'll just go through them in sequence. So the first thing that Vaughn talks about is write to your audience. So I've already kind of talked about this, and I guess your audience varies. In a sense, your audience is me, right? Because I'll be evaluating your paper. But when you're writing a philosophy paper and most academic papers, you shouldn't assume a very high level of expertise in the field. So don't assume I know don't assume I know the details of any given philosopher and what they wrote. So define all the key terms, give a general introduction to what they sort of thought. I mean, don't do a long history, but define all the relevant parts of the project to a layman. And like I've said before, your mom or your friend, just any reasonably competent person should be able to read your paper and get something out of it because it's not so technical and specific. So I think that's enough on that point. The second point that Vaughn brings up, and I've never explicitly said this, but it's useful, is avoid pretentiousness. And I think the biggest reason to do that, he talked about how it'll annoy your instructor and you want to avoid that, and that's true. But I think the other, probably more significant reason to avoid pretentiousness in your writing is for the sake of clarity. So if you have long convoluted sentences that use a string of multisyllabic words, it's sometimes hard to convey the central point that you're trying to get across. And if that point is lost, then your reader isn't getting anything out of your paper, and if they're not getting anything out of your paper, well, it's going to be hard to do well on that paper, and you're going to fail to convey what you were trying to get across. So in general, just try to make things straightforward and simple. That's the best way that you can show that you're competent and well versed, is just by clearly expressing things. There's no need to use a big word when a small word will do. Another thing that I noticed that was occurring in this week 5 reading is that people started sort of doing appeals to authority, and this is moving on to the next point. So point 3 is keep the authority of philosophers in perspective. So a lot of times people said, as Descartes already showed, or something like that. And in the philosophy world, that doesn't really work. A lot of the guys we read, like we didn't read Plato because I think he's right, and same thing goes with most of these guys. Just because they have some sort of interesting argument and something to teach us about the method of philosophy, as opposed to any sort of set of facts that we're supposed to get out of this. So just saying, well, Plato said it, so therefore it's true, is just kind of fallacious. If he said it and it's worth believing, there's an argument to support it. And the same thing goes with any other sort of claim you're interested in making. You can't just say, well, it was said in this book, or whoever told me this, or I believed it my whole life, or I believe it very strongly. If it's worth believing, you'll have support for it. So another note that Vaughn makes is don't overstate your premises or conclusions. One of the ways that I've seen this manifest is that people try to have really grandiose conclusions. Like they'll try to establish that the evil demon is real, or that we might be brains and bats, or that we are brains and bats, or something. Some really strong conclusion. Um, and the problem with that is that you just probably can't defend that sort of thesis in the course of 2,000 words, right? Like, people write books on these sorts of things. So um, I've been told, and I say it again because I think it's a good piece of wisdom, good philosophy is done slowly. And that just means that the argumentation and the conclusions drawn are very incremental, just going one step at a time to make, just one brick in the wall sort of contribution to a big field of thought, right? You're not trying to um, have a revolution here. We're just trying to make one solid conclusion that is well founded, not some sort of grandiose conclusion that you're going to have trouble supporting. The next point is treat opponents and opposing views fairly. So I talked about this in the very first week, and one way to think about this is in terms of the principle of charity. So you always want to take an opposing view as charitably as possible, and if you can show that it's wrong even after you interpreted it in a charitable fashion, then you've done a good job. If you strawman a position and then show that the strawman is false or doesn't make sense or trivial or something, you haven't done anything significant, because your opponent will just come back and say, you misinterpreted me, here's a better version that you missed. So before you go about undermining or attacking whatever position you're going to object to, make sure that you make it a good, reasonable position, and then try to show how it's false. So yeah, and part of this is just avoiding sort of fallacious reasoning. Hopefully this won't come up too much, but in the weekly writings there was a lot of stuff like, oh, Mackie is just so arrogant for even thinking that he can question God, and that might be true about him psychologically. He might have been an arrogant guy, but it's not really relevant to the argument, and it just comes off as an ad hominem. It shows that you're not intending to be fair with the argument, because you have some sort of personal, emotional grudge that you're trying to deal with, and that can undermine the point and the logic that you have to support your point. So be as charitable as you can be, and then show that they're still wrong or whatever, and then you've done a good job. Writing clearly. So the 6th point here, and this is probably the most important thing. All these other points might in some way be kind of derivative of this central point. And I guess one good idea that Vaughn mentions that I failed to note was a way to think about whether or not your writing is clear is take a sort of third-person perspective, right? So take a step back, kind of try to disassociate yourself with your views and the stuff you already know to be true or whatnot, and ask yourself, does this make sense? If I were new to this course, if this were my first day at Virginia Tech, would this still make sense to me? And if it doesn't, if just from a general background, there could be this sort of confusion, then you're going to have trouble, right? So a lot of times what people do is they have some specific idea in mind, but it's not so clear to the outside what they're trying to convey. And you have this, cool, complicated thought, but it's not expressed in a way that can be understood by someone that doesn't already know what you're thinking. So that's why it's important to take a step back. Maybe, if you're done with your paper in advance, give it 24 hours and then edit it once or twice again after you've had some distance, or, have a friend help you out, edit, do that sort of thing, and that will hopefully help along those lines. Another interesting point that Vaughn brings up is just sort of ambiguity in diction. So when you write any given sentence, you want to make it as obvious as possible and not up for interpretation. So that's one of the reasons why I discourage people from using rhetorical questions, because rhetorical questions leave it up to the reader more than you probably want. And if you haven't already well established your point thoroughly, it's very possible that your reader will just draw the opposite conclusion that you intend, or your open question is sort of ambiguous and they could draw any number of conclusions. some of which might not be consistent with your intended conclusion. So you want to assert things in a way that there isn't a whole range of possible interpretations. So an example that Mackey gives of a sentence that could have multiple interpretations is kids make great snacks. So the sentence kids make great snacks, there's the obvious interpretation, I think, that we generally think kids make themselves nutritious foods or something like that. They prepare good meals for themselves, like, kid makes peanut butter and jelly or mac and cheese or something like that. The alternative silly interpretation is kids are nutritious to consume, that eating children, right, is good for us or something like that. And in this case it seems kind of trivial. The former is the obvious way to interpret this, but this sort of problem can arise in all sorts of ways where it is genuinely ambiguous. And then the other thing that happens is if you're expecting your reader to make these sort of little interpretations over and over again throughout the course of a long paper, it can kind of be bumps in the road that lead to an unpleasant ride, so to speak. So, if it just happens once or twice, it's not a big deal. But at the end of reading a long paper and it's just filled with all these sorts of ambiguous, unclear, disorganized sentences, the reader will just have had to work harder to read your paper, and then the central point can be lost in the fact that each sentence have to make sure that they're getting it right because it's not obvious. So you want to make the reader's journey as easy as possible. Just direct, concise sentences with an active voice, and if you do that sort of thing, then they'll breeze through your paper and say, wow, that was well written, and be more charitable. And then another thing that helps clarity is giving examples. You might have an interesting idea, but it might not be obvious to your reader. So a good way to make it obvious to your reader is by presenting an example. So, Hume is great about that. I mean, think of all the great examples about, relations of ideas or an impression or whatever you want. He has an interesting example. And then the last point that I'm going to mention here quickly is avoid emotional appeals. And this has something to do with clarity as well. But it also just, because emotional appeals are a sort of distraction, I take it. And these can be more subtle than you might think. There's a lot of emotional appeals that you wouldn't commit, but there are some that you might have a tendency to. So, for example, people might say, oh, philosophy has really widened my horizons or something like that. Or philosophy is the most profound of fields or things like that. And to a certain extent, that doesn't seem relevant to your argument. That seems like it's a way to try to, appeal to your instructor who presumably thinks philosophy is an interesting, good field or something like that. And it just kind of distracts from your central point. So that's kind of an appeal to emotion that people are prone to commit. Another one is that claiming that ideas will kind of are bad for us or they're offensive, right? So sometimes people are like, oh, J.L. Mackey's evil and omnipotence is just plain offensive. And that's also sort of an appeal to emotion, right? Like, it may be true that it's offensive, but it also may be the case that the argument is sound. Those are compatible, right? Like, imagine some sort of crazy racist or something like that, right? And you tell them, oh, all humans are equal or something, and they'll be like, that's offensive. And it's like, so what if it's offensive? That's beside the point. So that isn't a legitimate strategy to object. So I hope that was useful. Like I said, you can go back through this 10-12 pages of reading, chapter 3 in the Vaughn, and hopefully this will help you a little bit more. And I've received a draft or two. That's awesome. If you still have drafts, you can send them to me. Don't send them to me on the 4th though, because that's too soon. So, but okay. Thanks for your time. I guess this is my last video, so I should say thanks for everything. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed it. And keep in mind that as far as I'm concerned, philosophy is more about a method of argumentation than any single set of facts or beliefs that you're supposed to draw from it. So, although I'm not necessarily committed to any of the specific views that occurred throughout the course of this class, I think the general method of using reason and argumentation to come to conclusions that we can all reasonably agree upon is invaluable. It's something that we all try to do on a daily basis, so being proficient in it will make a world of difference for the rest of your life when you're negotiating personal problems or interpersonal problems or political problems or trying to convince people of the right policies at the office or just life in general. So hopefully you can take that method with you if nothing else. Okay, thanks for your time. Bye.